Yeah, history of Marshall amps, the early years. When we think of electric guitar these days, we often think of the icons of your local classic rock radio station or modern hard rock bands. Marshall amps made it possible to get the sort of stadium filling, high gain crunch we now associate with rock. Technology always opens up new avenues for art, and the 100-watt stacks pioneered by Jim Marshall were no different. They created not only a new tonal palette but an entirely new concert experience. The JTM 45 1960 to 1963. Jim Marshall, the father of louder namesake of the company, was not a guitar player. He entered the London music scene as a drummer, first gigging with a local big band and eventually giving lessons out of his house. Originally named Jim Marshall's son. Jim and his son Terry Marshall opened their doors in July 1960 at 76 Uxbridge Road in Hanwell, England. Eventually, the store changed its name to JT Marshall and opened a second location across the street. Jim and Terry carried Vox and Selmer amps, but the band stopping by convinced them to import Fender and Gibson guitars and amps as well. The Selmer amps often broke down, so Jim hired a service tech. That person was Ken Brand, a former Pan Am aircraft engineer and musician. When Townshend and Entwistle, among others, started asking for amps that could give more than a Fender Bassman, one of the most powerful amps at the time, Bran was the one who opened up a 5F6A Bassman on loan from employee Mike Borer and created a schematic from its guts to use as the basis for an entirely new amp. With the demand for a new sound and the cost of importing amps from elsewhere, Ken was convinced they could and should produce their own. New design cemented Marshall amps went into the store's showroom in 1962. The first few specimens had an offset chassis and control panel, something Jim thought would better line up with the jacks on cabinets, making them rare collector's pieces these days. Production ramped up over the course of 1963 with more standardized centered chassis. The JTM 45 Mark I 1963 to 1966. This is the more commonly seen iteration of the JTM 45, as it represents the fully realized and standardized version of Marshall's first amp. It had two independent channels. Channel 1 had 6 dB more gain than the Channel 2, but it would be 15 years before Marshall built in channel switching. Both channels used the same GZ34 rectifier tube on their way to dual 5881 power tubes, leading some tinkering guitarists to use a short jumper cable to engage both input channels simultaneously. The low wattage speakers of the era meant the amp needed at least 4 of them, giving rise to the first Marshall cabinet design, closed back with 4 20-watt G1215 Alnico speakers made by London-based Celestion. By 1965, the Marshall JTM 45 Mark I was well known in London. Go to any show around town, and you'd see plenty of heads and cabinets sporting the metal plate, red block letter Marshall logo. The Bluesbreaker combos. Eric Clapton was another early adopter of Marshall amps, using them first with the Yardbirds and later with John Mayall. The particular amp Clapton eventually used on the Bluesbreakers' John Mayall with Eric Clapton album model 1962, the first Marshall combo, became something of an icon. Forever known as the Bluesbreaker combo. Common lore has it that Clapton asked Marshall to build him a combo that would fit in the boot of his car. While romantic and lionizing, this story is unfortunately not true. Marshall also made a series of 18-watt combo amps around the same time in 1965. Sometimes referred to as the Bluesbreakers' little brothers, they used much smaller EL84 power tubes. The 2X10 configuration was known as Model 1958, while the 2X12 was Model 1973 and the 1X12 was Model 1974. The first 5100-watt amps. In 1966, Marshall began building their already respected brand with more powerful amps and several cosmetic changes. More models started to sport the iconic script Marshall logo we now see today, and a new line of 50-watt amps took the market by storm. The new JTM 50 used EL34 power tubes instead of KT66s, which were harder to come by at the time, yielding a higher output and requiring a bigger output transformer. It also featured a solid-state rectifier, common practice nowadays, in place of the old GZ34 tube. These changes led to a brighter, louder sound with a different distortion character. In search of more power, Pete Townshend let Jim know that 50 watts was not going to be enough. In his words, he needed a sonic weapon, a mandate that led Marshall and his team on a quest to build an unprecedented 100-watt amp. In mid-1965, the first prototypes reached the century mark using 4 KT66 tubes with 250-watt transformers, since no 100-watt transformer existed at the time, and a solid-state rectifier. These early 100-watt versions of the JTM45 became the dual output production model, named for its two separate 50-watt Drake transformers. They had a tilted top Jim's idea and an open back for the top pair. Before too long enough roadies had quit that Pete came back and asked Marshall cut it in half, as a single 8x12 cab proved too unwieldy for his or anyone's road crew. What resulted was the first Marshall stack, with a 100-watt head placed atop two 4x12 cabs. Jim's original suggestion was taken and a legend was born. The Plexi name and the 100-watt Super Lead 1966 to 1969. The word Plexi is often used in reference to early Marshall amps. The term, however, doesn't officially refer to any one specific Marshall model. It merely refers to the acrylic plastic material plexiglass the company often used for its front and back faceplates from 1965 to 1969. These Plexi faceplates are gold-colored and smooth, not to be confused with the gold brushed metal used from 1969 onwards. If you should buy one, something we heartily recommend if you can pull it off, be careful when removing a Plexi chassis from its wooden case. The front panels chip easily. Just months later, Marshall made some changes to the faceplate and chassis, using a JTM logo of negative space inside a black flag and a steel chassis in place of aluminum. These mid-1967 features characterize what have come to be known as the Black Flag or JTM 100 heads. In just 4 years, the 100-watt Marshall head went from a pioneering prototype 1965 to a workable production model with a single output transformer 1966 to a road-tested industry standard with L34s and dual rectifiers 1967 to a refined legend with a split cathode preamp 1968. When the last true Plexi heads were made in 1969, a template and a reputation had already been well established. While the new heads moving into the 70s would have brushed metal gold faceplates, they still used mostly late Plexi era internals, with a bit more preamp filtering, updated transformers, and self-destruction protection going into the next decade. Marshall amps had hit their stride. The Marshall Major 1967 to 1974. We can't talk about Marshall history without mentioning the Marshall Major aka the Pig, a 200-watt version of the Super Lead introduced in 1967 for players like Ritchie Blackmore, who needed exceptional volume. Keep in mind that in these days, players still use their stage amps for all of their volume. If you wanted to be loud, you couldn't rely on the venue's PA to magnify your amp. With rock bands hungrily chasing ultimate volume, it was only a matter of time before a 200-watt head came to fruition. The Marshall Major was discontinued in 1974 after enjoying stage and studio time with the likes of John Entwistle, Mick Ronson, and Ritchie Blackmore. The JMP era 1967 to 1980. In late 1967, Marshall finally retired the JTM model prefix and replaced it with JMP for James Marshall Products, a name that would stick through 1981. In 1972, EL34 tubes were getting harder to come by, so the American distributor started replacing them with 6,550 tubes. In 1973, Marshall switched to printed circuit boards, no more point-to-point hand wiring, marking the end of an era, but not the end of classic Marshall tone. These post-1973 amps are considered less valuable, but whether or not they sound different is debatable. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Marshall speakers. Remember to subscribe for more stories and updates from the world of sound. Until next time, keep rocking with Marshall.